Hey everyone, welcome back to the Distinct Mastering YouTube channel. My name is Freddie. Today we're going to talk about the Fletcher-Munson curve. You may or may not have heard about this, but it is very important to kind of understand the basics. You don't need to understand all the details of it, but it is going to help you with your mixing and mastering. Fletcher-Munson curves, also known as equal loudness contours, are basically visual representations of how our ears perceive music and at what frequencies. Back in the 1930s, Fletcher and Munson set out to determine how our ears perceive loudness. And what they determined and what these graphs talk about is how loud the human ear perceives one frequency at an SPL level versus a different frequency. So let's take a look at the graph that Fletcher and Munson created back in the 1930s. Once again, these curves are a set of experimentally determined graphs that show how loud in decibels SPL, sound pressure levels, one frequency must be in order to be perceived equally as loud at another frequency. So for example, if you play a 1000 hertz tone at 80 dB SPL, how loud must 100 hertz or a 10 kilohertz or any other frequency for it to sound equally as loud as the other tone need to be? And what if the tone is playing at 40 SPL versus 80 SPL? Basically, if you have the volume turned up louder or quieter, you're going to have a different sound pressure level rating. So how is your ear going to pick that up? Okay, so you might be walking away a little bit more confused after looking at that graph than when we started at the video, but I'll try to break it down for you a little bit. Now, the equal loudness contour graphs have been updated, so let's take a look at the current standard that exists today. So when you look at this graph, one of the things that you see at the top is 100 FON. And you might be asking yourself, what is a FON? A FON is a unit of perceived loudness, and it's just another way of saying a measurement that is entirely subjective, but basically how our ears perceive the loudness. So the FON rating is basically telling you, when you look from the left, the sound pressure level that the sound is playing at versus the frequency down below at the bottom. And if so, for example, if you go at the 1000 mark, 1000 hertz, and you go up to, say, the sound pressure level of 40, you're going to see that the perceived loudness is quieter than if you are in the 2 to 3K mark, moving over to the right a tiny bit. So as you saw, in the 2 to 3K range, there's a boost of perceived loudness. Human ears are more receptive to that region, which makes sense because that is kind of the area where the human voice is, where the clarity of the voice is. Even a baby kind of crying is in that region. So it's very natural for our ears to have gotten accustomed when people are screaming, maybe they're in trouble. That is kind of the frequency that our ears perceive. And then you see around that area, we'll move back to the graph, it dips back down. So taking a look at this graph, 1000 hertz, 1000 hertz is in the middle of the graph, moving up to the sound pressure level of 70 dB, you're looking at 70 FONs. But the same frequency at, say, 100 dB SPL at the top is 100 FONs, 105 FONs or so. What you can see is how loud things need to be. Let's take an example here. Let's take 1000 hertz, and if you look at the 80 FON line, you see that it lines up with right on target. Pretty much at 80 dB SPL, your ears are going to perceive 1000 hertz. But if you go down to 100 hertz, it looks like you're at about the 80, 90 mark SPL to get the same perceived loudness at 100 hertz. So that means the 100 hertz tone is going to have to be played much louder than 1000 hertz for the human ear to perceive it to be the same volume. And if you take a look at where the human ear is most sensitive, you see that dip in the middle, and then it peaks around the 1000 to 3K mark. That is where the human ear is very sensitive to, voice and the sharpness and clarity and the edge of the human voice. And I've heard in the past that's kind of where when a baby is screaming, that is the frequency that the human ear picks up. So you can imagine over time our ears have become sensitive to that frequency due to just human nature. And so as you see also around 10K, our ears get a little more sensitive as well. And our ears perceive things in the high end to be louder than they are. So you might be asking yourself, what does this all mean for me and how does this affect my mixes? Well, it goes back to how loud do you like to mix? Do you crank your volume when you're mixing? Because if you do, then your high end is probably perceived a lot louder than it really is, or it could be throwing you off. Your low end sounds nice and boomy, but you have to think about this stuff. It's good to check your mixes loud, but it's good to mix at a good balance because the Fletcher-Munson curve can be throwing you off a little bit. Another thing that I'd like to add is this material is just subjective to lots and lots of different tests on different types of people. This may not be the response that your ears give you or your room gives you, but the takeaway here is that depending on the volume that you're mixing at, this could be throwing you off. And you don't need to understand all of it in detail. Even I don't understand every little bit in detail. It can get a little confusing, but the basics are important to know. The Fletcher-Munson curve. One frequency the human ear can perceive at a different loudness than another frequency, depending on how loud the SPL level, the sound pressure level of your source. So if you're mixing loud, you might perceive frequencies to be louder than they really are, especially in the high end and potentially in the low end or in the 2 to 3K range, 1 to 3K range. So I hope this helps you out to understand a little bit more about the Fletcher-Munson curve. If you want to get a little bit more in depth, it's just a Google search away. I suggest you check it out. And if you have any questions, please do shoot me a comment down below. I help people with their mixing and mastering, and if you need help with your mastering and you are a potential first-time client, I offer one free stereo mastered sample. Just check the link down below. My name is Freddie from Distinct Mastering, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and the bell notification will keep you up to date. Thank you again, and have a great day.